Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Filippos Letsas. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, based in Washington, D.C. And I'm particularly delighted to be joined by the Swiss ambassador to Greece, Ambassador Olaf Kjelsen. Thank you, Ambassador, so much for taking the time. Ambassador Kjelsen has been in Greece since June 2018. Prior to that, he served as Swiss ambassador to Liechtenstein, also as ambassador for the cross-border cooperation and relations with the neighboring states, as well as deputy head of mission in Brussels, in New Delhi, and Warsaw. And he also has experience serving in Moscow before that. So I'm particularly excited and interested in hearing his perspectives on the topic of our discussion today, which is Swiss neutrality and the war in Ukraine. So we don't have a lot of time. Ambassador, let me get right into it. Neutrality has been a core element of Switzerland's security and foreign policy since the founding of the Swiss Confederation in 1848. And in fact, even before that, as it was internationally recognized by the great powers at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. What does Swiss neutrality mean in practice, and how does it serve your country's interests on the global stage?
Thank you, Filippos, for those questions. Let me thank also the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to speak under the chapter Future, because I think neutrality has a future. What I'll be saying about neutrality regards the Swiss experience of it. I will leave it to you and to our public to infer what it might mean for other situations. There's been a discussion recently about the possible status of neutrality for the Ukraine, and some other European countries, Sweden, Finland, have also been discussing this issue recently. Let me also start by saying that Switzerland is not giving up its status of permanent, perpetual neutrality, which it gained formally at the Congress of Vienna with the help of Yannis Kapodistrias. I will revert to that a little later. But you ask what it means in practice. You have to make the difference between the law of neutrality and the practice of neutrality. The law of neutrality is quite simple. It is in the Treaty of The Hague from 1907, to which Switzerland of which Switzerland is a party. It says basically that you should not take part in an armed conflict on either side. Neutrality comes from the Latin ne uter, neither one. You should also not contribute to any armed conflict in the sense of supporting by armament or by favoring in any way a warring party. It applies to interstate conflicts, and this law has been also complemented with practice. The Hague Treaty of 1907 concerns only land and maritime conflict. Of course, aerial conflict has come added to this, and I can imagine that at some point there'll also be a discussion on the cyberspace or space, what neutrality means in this context. So basically, to summarize the law of neutrality, it means we cannot give any weapons, say, to the Ukraine or to Russia or any dual-use goods, and we cannot become member of a military defensive alliance. So Switzerland will not be a member of NATO. In addition to that, there's a whole complex issue of the policy of neutrality, which has evolved in time. And if you allow me, I'll briefly go back in history. First elements of discussion of neutrality were in the beginning of the Renaissance, at the time when Switzerland was increasing its influence in Europe. We had a staunch defeat against the French in Marignan in 1515. At that point, the Swiss cantons decided that war is a dangerous business. You don't know the outcome, and economically it's not a good thing. So they wisely decided to pull out of war, and the status of neutrality has helped preserve the territorial integrity and the Swiss independence ever since. There's some mention of it in the Westphalia treaties, but more importantly, the Vienna Congress of 1815 marking the end of the Napoleonic Wars, is the place where for the first time it was in writing that Switzerland is a neutral country. Why? The superpowers of the time, as you mentioned, the P5 of the time, wanted a neutral buffer state between France and Austria that no one would claim because it kept more stability and avoided conflict. So it was actually in the interest of the superpowers of the time to have Switzerland neutral. It has served us very well, to answer your second question, and that is why it is very popular in Switzerland. It's almost a holy cow, neutrality. It's something we are not ready to give up any soon. It preserved us from war. It actually even preserved us in a way from at the time of the founding of the federal state of Switzerland, of the conflict, religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. It's prevented Switzerland splitting during the First World War. Neutrality helped the cohesion of Switzerland because the French-speaking might have been leaning towards the French and the German-speaking towards the German. But Switzerland is based on an idea, a political idea that we want to govern ourselves and be independent. And neutrality is, in this sense, an important instrument. Of course, during World War II, it also preserved us from the conflict. Mentioning World War II, there's been some criticism after the war. How could Switzerland be neutral towards the Nazis? The thing is, at some point, Switzerland was surrounded by the forces of the Axis. And for us, neutrality meant actually surviving in this space as an independent country. There were some compromises. But for example, before the war, 80% of our trade was done with Germany. So during the war, we had to continue to do trade with Germany for our own survival. We cannot criticize a country for trading in terms of neutrality. Neutrality is about not taking part in an armed conflict. The concept of neutrality has evolved in time. After 9/11, the Swiss government stated there can be no neutrality in the face of international terrorism. And during the war in Yugoslavia, Switzerland adopted the sanctions of the EU. So there's a practice of adopting sanctions of our main partners. Now with Ukraine, it's just incredibly dramatic. This is a game changer. That's why it got so prominent, but the practice of taking sanctions is not new.
That's exactly what I wanted to get to next. The scale of Russian aggression against Ukraine has pushed Switzerland to join the EU in announcing unprecedented sanctions against Russia, which have exceeded 7.5 billion Swiss francs, $8 billion US to date. According to a survey that was conducted, I believe, just 2 weeks ago, in late March, the majority of the Swiss population seems to be in favor of even tougher sanctions against Russia at the moment, even if this results in higher energy prices and further economic pain. How do you see these developments from the Swiss perspective affecting EU-Swiss relations and Russian-Swiss relations in the long term?
Okay. The sanctions are one instrument of foreign policy, just as neutrality is another instrument of foreign policy. There are some, they touch in some points, but they are not equal. As I mentioned before, you can adopt sanctions without compromising your status of neutrality. Switzerland is basically not a great fan of sanctions. We often observe that they reinforce the autocrats in their discourse. We are under attack, and they affect the populations. But we certainly want to make sure that Switzerland is not used as a place to circumvent the sanctions of our main partners. And so we adopt the sanction. We never align. We adopt autonomously the sanctions of our main like-minded partners. Nota bene, we have not taken all the sanctions. We have not forbidden those Russian language media, Russia Today and whatever the other one is, because we consider that it's better to stick to our own principles of freedom of the media and to counter propaganda with truth. You mentioned the impressive number of the Swiss who support the sanctions. There's such number of Swiss who support neutrality. For the last 20 years, it has always been over 80% of the population, and at the last census, it was 89% who supports neutrality. And about a fourth of the population is for a very strict, non-compromising status of neutrality, so actually not being flexible on the policy of neutrality. So there's a really strong backing in the Swiss population for this. But neutrality does not mean that you shouldn't speak out. And neutrality is not equal to impartiality. We can, in this Ukrainian military aggression, we know who is the aggressor, and we say that we state very firmly that we condemn and don't agree with the actions of the Russian side. We also use neutrality as an instrument to promote our own principles, the respect of international law, the respect of international humanitarian law, and of human rights. To summarize, there's no problem in speaking out when you're neutral. You asked the question about the relations with the EU and relations with Russia. Switzerland tries to place itself and promote itself as being a trustful partner of the EU. We've had our differences with the EU on certain issues, but basically in foreign policy we are very like-minded. We support, through our status of neutrality and our non-membership in the EU and NATO, we also offer our good offices, always in close consultation with the EU and with our partners. So there's an advantage also for our partners in our status of neutrality. In our relations to Russia, I think they respect the fact that we are not member of NATO, and we have already provided good offices in the past, even though we criticized the annexion of Crimea and the starting of the war in the Donbass region. We still, to this day, continue to represent the Russian interest in Georgia.
At his first State of the Union address in early March, President Biden said, quote, "Even Switzerland is inflicting pain on Russia and supporting the people of Ukraine." When the President of the United States mentions Switzerland's policy shift before a joint session of Congress, could we say that we have reached a watershed moment for the country's role in the world? And do you think that this might be a prelude to a new era of Swiss foreign policy?
We've certainly reached a watershed in European history and in the architecture of security of Europe. And this has been the topic of many discussions in this Delphi Economic Forum. For the Swiss foreign policy, I think what my explanations have highlighted that there's a continuity in our action. We criticize whoever violates international law, because we depend so much on international law, and we stand up for the multilateral framework that is protecting actually smaller countries. But there's a new era, and Switzerland has put its candidacy for non-permanent seats in the Security Council for the years 2023-2024, after 20 years of membership in the UN. So there's a visible step more in the sense of interpreting neutrality in a new way. For example, sanctions that are decided by the UN Security Council are taken automatically. There's a provision in the Swiss law that we don't even need to decide. Those are taken automatically. And we also adopt automatically sanctions by the OSCE, because we consider those bodies to be universal. And you cannot be neutral in the face of universality. Being universal by definition is not taking sides. But there's an important fact about neutrality, and if you allow me, I'll just want to also summarize this. Neutrality lives only by its credibility. It is a continuous work to support it, to remain credible, to respect its principles on the long term, on a voluntary basis. Nobody can be forced to be neutral. And I haven't mentioned it, but Switzerland has a so-called armed neutrality. We have a sizable army ready to defend our territory. One of the obligations of neutral states is not to allow the use of its territory by warring parties. We've done that in the past, and in the case of the Ukraine war, we are not allowing overflights of our territory. That would be contrary to the law of neutrality. It is very important to be armed to make your neutrality credible, as the example of Belgium during the Second World War has shown. Actually, neutrality exists only if it is recognized by the others. You cannot be neutral on your own. You can just raise your flag and say, I'm neutral. It has to be recognized by the others, as it was during the Viennese Congress, or as it can be in the case of Turkmenistan by a resolution of the United Nations. Only the others can recognize it.
Final question before we wrap up. If we zoom out for a second, having this discussion, the same discussion a year from now, Delphi 2023, what is your vision for Europe's security architecture? What is the best case scenario, and how do we get there?
I'm glad you're asking the question how it will be in 1 year, not in how it will be in 10 years. I have to admit that even though I've been studying Russia for a long time, I was posted 4 years in Russia, I was there as a student, I speak Russian, I certainly did not predict this military aggression. I really didn't think that they would do that. So it is very difficult to
make a prediction,
to make a provision, to sort of think how it will be in 1 year. I hope that by then the conflict will be over, that it will not be a frozen conflict, that a solution will have been found, appealing to the reason, but also to the respect of law and the international framework. I think this is one of the main tasks of the, call it the West, to which Switzerland actually belongs, to the like-minded democratic countries, to defend the multilateral system. And in 1 year, Switzerland will be hopefully member of the Security Council. We'll have our experience in deciding how to help promote peace. We've been doing that in the past consistently, but it will take a new dimension, being really within the place where this is mainly being discussed. I actually would hope to be here in 1 year. It's not very probable, since I'm arriving at the end of my diplomatic term in Athens. It was a wonderful period. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Greece is an incredible country, and I really wish to the Greek people peace and prosperity for the future.
Well, I'm sure the organizers will be delighted to have you back in your new capacity as well. But it has been a real pleasure having this fireside conversation with you. Thank you very much. Any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Don't ask a diplomat for wisdom. We are practitioners.
That works as well. Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.